Did you know the microwave in your kitchen came from military radar technology? Or that the massive fields of corn you see on a cross-country drive exist because of factories that once made explosives? The food we eat, the way it's grown, and even the aisles of our supermarkets are haunted by the ghosts of a global conflict that ended decades ago. It wasn't just a war of armies and machines. It was a war of food, a war of calories, logistics, and scientific breakthroughs. It forced a complete reinvention of how humanity fed itself, and we are still living with the consequences, good and bad. How did a desperate need to feed soldiers in faraway lands lead to the TV dinner? Why did governments suddenly care so much about the vitamins you were eating? And what if the very tools designed to create agricultural abundance also planted the seeds of our modern environmental crises? The story of our food is a war story. It's a story about desperation, innovation, and unintended consequences that reach right onto our dinner plates tonight. Number 19. Could a chemical designed to fight insects in the jungle end up in our kitchens? It seems like a strange question, but the answer is yes, and it happened on a massive scale. Before the 1940s, farmers fought pests with things that had been used for centuries. They used natural chemicals like arsenic, lead, and nicotine. They rotated crops. They encouraged beneficial insects. It was a constant, slow battle. But the Second World War changed the nature of this battle completely. The conflict wasn't just fought in trenches. It was fought in jungles and swamps, places teeming with insects, or malaria, carried by mosquitoes, and typhus, carried by lice, were taking out more soldiers than bullets in some theaters of operation. A new weapon was needed, not against other soldiers, but against bugs. The weapon arrived in the form of a white crystalline powder, dichlorodephényl trichloroethane. We know it as DDT. A Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Muller had discovered its potent insect-killing properties in 1939. The discovery was so significant he would later win a Nobel Prize in 1948. For the Allied forces, it was a miracle. The U.S. military put DDT into production on an industrial scale. They used it to spray entire islands in the Pacific before invasions. They dusted soldiers and civilians with it in Europe to stop typhus outbreaks. Newsreels from the era show people being sprayed head to toe, smiling as if it were a harmless cloud. It was seen as a liberator, a chemical that would win the war and save millions of lives. And when the war ended, the massive chemical factories that had been churning out DDT for the military needed a new customer. They found one in the American farmer. The United States Department of Agriculture, once cautious about new chemicals, became a huge promoter of DDT. The message was simple. If it could protect soldiers, it could protect crops, and it worked at first. Our farmers sprayed it on everything from cotton to potatoes to apples. Crop yields soared. It seemed like humanity had finally conquered the pests that had plagued agriculture since the beginning of time. The chemical age of farming had begun, but there was a dark side. DDT was a persistent chemical. It didn't break down in the environment. It seeped into the soil and washed into the rivers. It accumulated in the fatty tissues of animals. This process is called biomagnification. A small bug would eat the chemical, a bigger bug would eat that bug, a fish would eat the bigger bug, and a bird would eat the fish. At each step, the concentration of DDT grew stronger. This was the story told by biologist Rachel Carson in her groundbreaking 1962 book, Silent Spring. She documented how DDT was devastating bird populations, particularly birds of prey like the bald eagle, by making their eggshells too thin to survive. Carson's book launched the modern environmental movement and led to a massive public outcry. The government that had once promoted DDT was forced to re-examine it. In 1972, the Environmental Protection Agency banned its use in the United States, but the legacy was set. The war had proven that industrial chemistry could be applied to farming with dramatic short-term results. It created a mindset of solving agricultural problems with a chemical spray, a mindset that still dominates much of industrial agriculture today. The war on insects had moved from the battlefield to the farm field, and it never really ended. What if the war hadn't created such a massive industrial capacity for producing chemicals? How many other persistent compounds from that era are still cycling through our ecosystems? Their effects unknown. What traditional non-chemical farming knowledge was lost forever when the sprayer became the primary tool? And if we found a new miracle chemical today, how would we know if we were repeating the same mistake? Number 18, what if weeds were an enemy you could fight with chemistry? Just as the war created a new way to fight insects, it also created a new way to fight a farmer's other great enemy, weeds. For millennia, dealing with weeds was backbreaking work. It meant tilling, hoeing, and pulling them out by hand. It was a never-ending chore that limited the size of farms and consumed immense amounts of labor. During the war, with so many men serving overseas, labor was in critically short supply. A solution was needed to help fewer people manage more land. The solution came from chemical research that was initially exploring plant growth hormones. Scientists were looking for ways to make plants grow faster or to develop new biological weapons. In the process, they stumbled upon something fascinating. At certain concentrations, these growth hormones could make plants grow so fast they essentially destroyed themselves. They had found a way to kill specific types of plants while leaving others unharmed. One of the most famous of these discoveries was 2,4-D, a synthetic auxin that selectively kills broadleaf weeds, the kind that plague fields of grain like corn and wheat, without harming the crop itself. The research was conducted in secret at facilities like Camp Detrick in Maryland, the center of U.S. biological warfare research. The potential military application was to spray enemy crops to destroy their food supply, but as the war drew to a close, the commercial potential became obvious. In 1945, the American Chemical Paint Company began marketing 2,4-D as a commercial herbicide. It was revolutionary. A farmer could now do with a single pass of a sprayer what would have previously taken a whole crew of workers weeks to accomplish. This changed the very structure of farming. A single family could now manage hundreds or even thousands of acres. It was a key step in the transition from small family farms to the massive agricultural operations we see today. Along with mechanization and synthetic fertilizers, chemical herbicides completed a trifecta of technologies that defined post-war industrial agriculture. The clean, weed-free fields we now associate with modern farming are a direct result of this wartime research. The idea of a monoculture, a vast field of a single crop, became economically viable because weeds could be controlled chemically rather than mechanically or through crop rotation. Of course, this revolution had consequences. The widespread use of herbicides led to the development of herbicide-resistant superweeds, creating a chemical arms race where stronger and more complex chemicals are needed to achieve the same result. The most famous example of a related chemical is 2,4,5-T, which, when combined with 2,4-D, created a notorious defoliant used in later conflicts. Concerns about the long-term health effects of these chemicals on farm workers and the environment persist to this day. Studies published in journals like the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health continue to explore links between herbicide exposure and various health problems. The chemical warfare research of the 1940s never really stopped. It just moved from military targets to our farmland. What would our farms look like today if hand weeding and crop rotation were still the primary methods of weed control? How has the reliance on herbicides altered the biodiversity of our soil and the insects and animals that depend on it? By making it so easy to kill unwanted plants, have we lost our appreciation for the complex role that weeds can play in a healthy ecosystem? And are we now trapped in a cycle of chemical dependency on our farms that we can no longer escape? Number 17, could a factory for bombs be turned into a factory for food? This sounds impossible. Bombs destroy, food sustains, but the chemistry that connects them is surprisingly simple, and it changed the world. The key ingredient is nitrogen. Nitrogen is essential for all life. It's a critical component of proteins and DNA. While the air we breathe is almost 80% nitrogen, plants can't use it in its atmospheric form. It has to be fixed or converted into a usable form like ammonia. For centuries, this was the great limiting factor of agriculture. Farmers relied on manure, compost, and planting legumes like clover that naturally fixed nitrogen in the soil. The amount of food the world could produce was directly tied to the amount of fixed nitrogen available. That all changed in the early 20th century with the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, a method for synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen under high pressure and temperature. Its inventors, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, won Nobel Prizes. The process was first used to create chemical fertilizers, but it was quickly adapted to create explosives. Nitrates derived from ammonia are the key ingredient in munitions like TNT. During the Second World War, governments built enormous factories to produce ammonia for the war effort. The United States, for example, constructed 10 massive ammonia plants capable of producing millions of tons of the chemical for bombs and shells. When the war ended in 1945, these huge factories stood idle. They were a massive government investment with no obvious purpose. But a few forward-thinking individuals, like officials in the Tennessee Valley Authority, saw an opportunity. Instead of shutting the plants down, why not repurpose them? Instead of making explosives, they could make fertilizer. And that's exactly what happened. The same industrial infrastructure that had been built to fuel destruction was retooled to fuel an agricultural boom. The effect was staggering. Suddenly, nitrogen was no longer a limiting factor. It was cheap, abundant, and available everywhere. Farmers could apply synthetic fertilizer and see an immediate, dramatic increase in crop yields. This was a cornerstone of the Green Revolution that would follow in the post-war decades. It allowed the world's population to grow at a rate never before seen. A 2008 study published in Nature Geoscience by scientist Vaclav Smil estimated that without the Haber-Bosch process, the world could only support about half of its current population. In a very real sense, billions of people alive today owe their existence to these repurposed munitions plants. But this flood of cheap nitrogen came with a heavy price. The massive overuse of synthetic fertilizers has led to nitrogen runoff, which pollutes rivers, lakes, and oceans. This runoff creates massive dead zones, areas where algae blooms fueled by the excess nitrogen consume all the oxygen in the water, killing off fish and other marine life. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is one of the most infamous examples. The production of synthetic fertilizer is also incredibly energy intensive, relying heavily on natural gas and contributing significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. The war provided a tool for unprecedented abundance, but it also fundamentally altered the planet's nitrogen cycle in ways we are still struggling to manage. How much of our modern food system is still reliant on the infrastructure and mindset of a wartime economy? If the cost of natural gas skyrockets, could our ability to produce fertilizer and therefore food be crippled overnight? Have we become so dependent on synthetic nitrogen that we've forgotten how to farm in a way that works with nature's cycles? What is the true long-term environmental cost of feeding half the world's population with a process originally designed for warfare? Number 16. Did the war kill the family farm? For generations, the image of farming was one of small, diverse family operations. A family might have some dairy cows, some chickens, a field of corn, a patch of vegetables. But the Second World War created pressures that accelerated the shift away from this model and toward the large-scale, specialized farming we know today. The primary pressure was a severe labor shortage. Millions of men left the farms to join the military or to work in high-paying defense industries in the cities. In the United States alone, the farm population dropped by millions between 1940 and 1945. This created a crisis. How could the country feed itself and its allies with fewer people working the land? The answer was to replace human power with machine power. The war effort demanded immense industrial production of tanks, planes, and trucks. This ramped up the manufacturing capabilities of companies like Ford, International Harvester, and John Deere. When the war ended, that industrial might was turned toward producing agricultural machinery. Tractors, which had been slowly gaining popularity, became essential. And new, more efficient combines and other implements were developed. A government report from the U.S. Bureau of Agricultural Economics in 1947 noted the dramatic shift. The number of tractors on American farms had increased by more than 50% during the war years. This mechanization had a profound effect. A single person with a tractor could now do the work of many people with draft animals. This meant farms had to get bigger to justify the investment in expensive machinery. The old 40-acre family farm was no longer an efficient unit. The era of get big or get out had begun. This trend was further fueled by government policies that began during the war. To ensure a steady food supply, governments encouraged farmers to specialize and maximize production of key commodities like wheat, corn, and dairy. Price supports and subsidies favored large-scale producers of these staple crops. The diverse farm, which spread risk across many different products, was replaced by the monoculture farm, which focused all its resources on producing a single commodity as efficiently as possible. This was the birth of industrial agriculture as we know it. The social consequences were enormous. The rural landscape of America and other nations was transformed. Small towns that had supported farming communities began to shrink as people moved to cities for work. The connection between the average person and the source of their food became more distant. Farming changed from a way of life to a highly capitalized business. The number of farms in the U.S. peaked at nearly 7 million in the 1930s. Today, it is around 2 million, yet they produce far more food on roughly the same amount of land. This incredible increase in productivity came at the cost of the traditional family farm and the rural communities it supported. The war, in its demand for efficiency above all else, set the stage for this massive consolidation. Is it possible to have an agricultural system that is both highly efficient and supportive of small, diverse farms? What cultural knowledge was lost when millions of people left the land for factories and cities? How did the shift to mechanization change our relationship with the land itself, turning it from a partner to be nurtured into a resource to be exploited? And can a food system dominated by a few massive corporations truly be considered secure? Number 15. How did we learn to ship a salad across an ocean? Today, we take it for granted that we can buy fresh strawberries in January or asparagus from Peru in our local supermarket. This global food supply chain, a marvel of logistics, has its roots in the immense challenge of feeding millions of soldiers spread across the entire globe during the Second World War. Before the war, most food was consumed relatively close to where it was produced. Shipping perishable goods over long distances was difficult and expensive. But the war made it a necessity. The military had to solve an unprecedented logistical problem: how to move massive quantities of food across oceans and continents to keep armies fighting. This wasn't just about non-perishables like flour and sugar. Nutritionists gaining influence during this period stressed the importance of vitamins and morale. This meant finding ways to ship fruits, vegetables, and meat to the front lines. This challenge spurred a revolution in food processing, packaging, and transportation. Dehydration was one key innovation. By removing water, foods like eggs, milk, and potatoes became lighter, smaller, and less prone to spoilage. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps worked with scientists to perfect industrial dehydration techniques. By 1944, over 100 U.S. plants were dehydrating potatoes. This research directly led to the instant mashed potatoes and powdered milk that became staples in post-war kitchens. Freezing technology also took a huge leap forward. Clarence Birdseye had developed flash freezing methods in the 1920s, but it was the war's demand for high-quality preserved food that expanded the industry. The military became a major buyer of frozen foods, which helped to scale up production and improve the technology. Packaging was also critical. The iconic K-ration, a daily meal for an individual soldier, was a masterpiece of packaging design intended to be waterproof, durable, and compact. The development of new materials and canning techniques ensured that food could survive rough handling and long journeys. This intense focus on preservation and packaging laid the groundwork for the modern supermarket, with its shelves of products designed for a long shelf life. Beyond processing, the war perfected the science of logistics itself. The military developed complex systems to track supplies, manage inventory, and coordinate transportation by ship, rail, and truck. The Red Ball Express, an enormous truck convoy system that supplied Allied armies in Europe after the D-Day landings, is a famous example of this logistical prowess. It moved hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, including food, to the front. After the war, these logistical principles were adapted by the private sector, and companies learned how to manage vast, complex supply chains, making it possible to move a head of lettuce from California to New York, or a shipment of bananas from Ecuador to London with predictable efficiency. The global food system is the peacetime application of wartime logistics. What is the true energy cost of our global supply chain, which flies and ships food thousands of miles? How vulnerable is this complex, just-in-time system to disruptions like pandemics, fuel shortages, or political conflicts? By focusing so much on shelf life and transportability, have we sacrificed flavor and nutritional value in our food? And what happens to a community's food security when it becomes completely dependent on food that comes from somewhere else? Number 14, could your grandmother's garden have been a weapon of war? It sounds gentle, almost quaint, a victory garden. But during the Second World War, these small plots of land in backyards, city parks, and on rooftops were part of a massive coordinated effort on the home front. They were a genuine weapon of war, and they fundamentally changed the relationship between civilians and their food supply. The rationale was straightforward. The war effort required huge amounts of food to be shipped overseas to feed soldiers. It also required the industrial food system canning factories, transportation networks, and labor to be focused on that military goal. This created a potential food shortage for the civilian population. The government's solution was to ask citizens to feed themselves. Our posters with slogans like "Sow the seeds of victory" and "Our food is fighting" became ubiquitous. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture actively promoted the program, distributing pamphlets and instructional guides on how to plant, cultivate, and preserve food. The campaign was wildly successful. At its peak in 1944, it's estimated that nearly 20 million victory gardens were planted in the U.S. alone. These gardens produced an astonishing amount of food. According to the USDA, they were responsible for over 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the country during that time. This was more than just a practical food production program. It was a powerful tool for morale. It gave ordinary people, women, children, the elderly a tangible way to contribute to the war effort. Tending a garden was a patriotic act. It connected the home front directly to the battlefront. When you planted a carrot, you were helping to free up a canned good for a soldier. It also fostered a sense of community, as people shared tools, seeds, and advice. In the United Kingdom, the Dig for Victory campaign was similarly successful, transforming public parks and even the moat of the Tower of London into vegetable patches. The Victory Garden movement had a lasting impact on American and British food culture. It introduced many people to a wider variety of vegetables and gave them skills in gardening and food preservation that had been lost by a generation that had grown accustomed to buying food from a store. The practice of home canning, for example, saw a massive resurgence. The government reported that over 3.5 billion jars of food were canned in American homes in 1943 alone. After the war, with the return of industrial food abundance and the rise of suburban culture, the home gardening movement faded. The lawns replaced vegetable patches, supermarkets filled with convenient processed foods made the hard work of gardening seem unnecessary. But the memory of the Victory Garden has a long legacy. It represents a time when the nation's food security was seen as a shared responsibility, not just the domain of corporations. The community garden and urban farming movements of today are direct descendants of this wartime effort, seeking to reconnect people with their food and rebuild local food systems. Why did we so quickly abandon a system of decentralized local food production as soon as the crisis was over? What level of food growing and preservation skills has the general population lost since that time? If a similar national crisis happened today, would we have the knowledge, the seeds, and the community spirit to recreate the Victory Garden effort? And how much more resilient would our food system be if millions of small gardens were still a part of it? Number 13. How did the war put women in the driver's seat of a tractor? Before the war, farming was overwhelmingly seen as men's work. While women had always played crucial roles on family farms, the public face of agriculture and the person operating the heavy machinery was male. The mass mobilization of men for military service created a labor vacuum that threatened to cripple food production. This crisis opened the door for women to take on new, visible, and physically demanding roles in agriculture, forever changing perceptions of what women's work could be. In the United Kingdom, the government resurrected an organization from the First World War, the Women's Land Army. From 1939, it recruited thousands of young women, often from cities with no farming experience, to work on farms across the country. These land girls took on every task imaginable, from plowing fields and harvesting crops to managing livestock and pest control. They were vital to keeping Britain fed during a time when German U-boats were attempting to starve the island nation by sinking supply ships. By 1944, over 80,000 women were serving in the land army. In the United States, the situation was similar. While the U.S. didn't have a single formal organization like the British Land Army for the entire war, the Women's Land Army of America was revived, and various state and local programs recruited women for farm labor. A government publication from the period, The Woman's Place in the War, explicitly called on women to fill the places of men on the farms. Millions of women who were already living in rural areas stepped up to run their family farms while their husbands, fathers, and brothers were away. They learned to operate and maintain complex machinery, make financial decisions, and manage the entire business of the farm. This was a profound social shift. It challenged traditional gender roles and proved that women were more than capable of handling the toughest jobs in agriculture. And photographs and newsreels from the time show women confidently driving tractors and operating combines, images that would have been shocking just a few years earlier. This experience empowered a generation of women, giving them new skills and a new sense of independence. However, this change was not without its challenges. The women often faced skepticism from older, traditional male farmers. The work was physically demanding, and the pay was often low. And when the war ended and the men returned, there was immense social pressure for women to return to their traditional domestic roles. Many did, but the experience was not forgotten. The war had planted a seed. It demonstrated that the agricultural workforce could be more diverse and that rigid gender roles were not immutable. This wartime experience helped lay the groundwork for later feminist movements and the gradual, though still incomplete, recognition of women's contributions to agriculture. The story of women in farming is no longer just about the farmer's wife. Today, the USDA reports that over a third of American farmers are women, and they are one of the fastest growing demographics in agriculture. The land girls and their American counterparts were pioneers who proved that a woman's place could be behind the wheel of a tractor. After proving their capability, why was there such a strong push to remove women from these roles after the war? How many innovations or different approaches to farming were lost when that wave of new participants was encouraged to leave the field? What unspoken history of women's agricultural labor existed for centuries before the war finally made it visible on a national scale? And how much of the traditional image of the male farmer is a product of post-war culture rather than a timeless reality? Number 12. Why did your government suddenly start telling you what to eat? For most of history, what you ate was a matter of personal choice, tradition, or economic necessity. The idea of a national government-directed nutrition policy was a foreign concept. The Second World War changed that. For the first time, governments began to see the diet of their citizens as a matter of national security. A well-fed soldier could fight better. A well-fed factory worker could produce more. A healthy population was a more resilient population. This new focus on nutrition was driven by scientific discoveries made in the decades leading up to the war. Scientists had identified vitamins and minerals and were beginning to understand their role in preventing diseases like scurvy and rickets. When the war began, and with it the threat of food shortages and rationing, governments turned to these scientists to figure out how to keep their populations healthy on a limited diet. This was the birth of modern nutritional science as a tool of public policy. In the United States, the Food and Nutrition Board was established in 1941. One of its first tasks was to create a set of dietary guidelines to help officials plan for military and civilian food needs. The result was the first recommended dietary allowances, or RDAs. These guidelines specified the amount of calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals needed to maintain health. The government then used this information to shape its food policies. They launched massive public education campaigns with posters and radio ads promoting the basic 7 food groups, a precursor to the food pyramid. It was a national effort to teach people how to eat for strength and for victory. This new nutritional focus also led to the first large-scale food fortification programs. To combat nutrient deficiencies, the U.S. government mandated the enrichment of flour and bread with iron and B vitamins like thiamine and niacin. This decision, made in 1941, is credited with virtually eliminating diseases like pellagra and beriberi, which were still common in parts of the country. It established a precedent for government intervention in the food supply to improve public health. In the United Kingdom, the rationing system was explicitly designed around nutritional principles. The Ministry of Food, under the leadership of Lord Woolton, worked closely with scientists like Jack Drummond to ensure that the ration book provided a diet that, while monotonous, was nutritionally adequate. In fact, studies conducted after the war showed that the health of the British population, particularly the poorest segments, actually improved during the war due to the guaranteed access to a balanced, if limited, diet. Infant mortality declined, and the average height of children increased, The war cemented the idea that the government has a legitimate and important role to play in the nutrition of its citizens. The RDAs, food guides, school lunch programs, and food fortification that we see today are all direct descendants of these wartime initiatives. The conflict turned the dinner plate into an instrument of state policy, forever linking public health, food science, and national interest. Did the focus on a few key nutrients lead to an oversimplified view of nutrition that we still struggle with today? By medicalizing food, do we lose a more cultural or intuitive understanding of what it means to eat well? How much did wartime food industry lobbying influence which foods were declared essential in these new government guidelines? And what is the proper balance between government guidance on nutrition and an individual's freedom to choose what they eat? And number 11, could a system for controlling prices in a crisis become permanent? Before the war, the prices of agricultural goods were largely determined by the free market. This led to wild swings. A bumper crop could cause prices to collapse, bankrupting farmers, while a drought could cause prices to skyrocket, hurting consumers. The Great Depression had made this volatility painfully clear. When the Second World War began, governments knew they could not leave the food supply to the whims of the market. They needed to guarantee a stable supply of food at predictable prices to support the war effort and prevent civil unrest. To achieve this, they implemented a system of massive government intervention in the agricultural economy. This included price controls, subsidies, and production targets. In the United States, the Office of Price Administration was established in 1941 to control inflation across the economy, with a major focus on food. The government set ceiling prices on what food processors could charge and what retailers could sell for, to ensure farmers kept producing. Even with these price caps, the government also guaranteed them a minimum price for their crops. If the market price fell below a certain level, the government would step in and buy the surplus. This was a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the farmer. The farmer was no longer just an independent business person, they were a partner in a national project. The government told them what to plant: more wheat, more soybeans for oil, more peanuts, and guaranteed them a market for it. This system, outlined in laws like the Stiegel Amendment of 1941, was designed to encourage massive production of the commodities needed for the war. This system of subsidies and price supports was intended to be a temporary emergency measure, but it never went away. After the war, farm state politicians and powerful agricultural lobbies argued to keep the programs in place. They had grown accustomed to the stability and predictability it provided. This led to the series of farm bills that have been a staple of U.S. politics ever since. These bills continue the basic wartime structure, subsidizing the production of major commodity crops like corn, soy, wheat, and cotton. The long-term consequences of this are all around us. The subsidy system heavily favors large farms over small ones, accelerating the consolidation of agriculture that began during the war. It encourages farmers to produce as much of the subsidized crops as possible, leading to the vast monocultures that dominate the American Midwest. This overproduction of corn and soy, in turn, provides cheap raw materials for the processed food and livestock industries. The abundance of cheap corn, for example, is directly linked to the prevalence of high fructose corn syrup in soft drinks and the economics of large-scale cattle feedlots. The wartime emergency created a permanent economic structure for our food system. What started as a tool to ensure a steady supply of food for a nation at war became the architecture of our modern agricultural economy, shaping what is grown, who grows it, and what ends up on our plates. The British experience was similar, with the Post-War Agriculture Act of 1947 continuing a system of guaranteed prices and subsidies to ensure national food security. How does a temporary government program become a permanent feature of the economy for over 80 years? What would our diets and our farms look like if food was not subsidized in this way? How has the focus on subsidizing commodity crops affected the production and price of fruits and vegetables? And is a system designed to maximize production for a crisis in the 1940s the right system to deal with the health and environmental challenges of the 21st century? Number 10 was the TV dinner born on a bomber. The idea of a complete prepackaged meal seems like the ultimate symbol of 1950s convenience, but the technology and the concept behind it were developed out of military necessity a decade earlier. The challenge was feeding air crews on long-range bombing missions. These flights could last for many hours, and the crews needed to eat. Preparing a meal in the cramped, often unpressurized and freezing cold conditions of a B-17 bomber was not practical. The military needed a way to provide a hot meal that required minimal effort to prepare. This led to experiments with frozen meals. The military worked with companies like W.L. Max and Company to develop what they called sky plates. These were complete meals, typically meat, a vegetable, and a potato that were pre-cooked, frozen, and arranged on a disposable tray. On the bomber, these trays could be heated up in a special convection oven, the Maxim Whirlwind oven, designed for in-flight use. This was one of the first instances of a complete frozen meal designed for reheating. The technology was still in its early stages, but the concept was revolutionary. It proved that you could mass produce, freeze, and reheat entire meals, breaking the traditional link between cooking and eating. When the war ended, the entrepreneurs and companies involved in these military projects saw a huge potential civilian market. The social conditions were perfect. Women had entered the workforce in large numbers during the war, and many continued to work afterwards. The post-war economic boom led to more disposable income and a growing demand for time-saving, convenient products. The company C.A. Swanson & Sons is credited with popularizing the concept. In 1953, the company found itself with a massive surplus of Thanksgiving turkey, hundreds of tons of it, on refrigerated train cars. A Swanson salesman named Jerry Thomas, inspired by the prepackaged meals he had seen used by airlines which had adopted the military's in-flight meal concept, came up with the idea of a frozen turkey dinner. He designed a 3-compartment aluminum tray, mimicking the military and airline versions, and the US-TV dinner was born. It was an instant success. In 1954, its first full year of production, Swanson sold over 10 million turkey dinners. The product perfectly captured the spirit of the age, modern, convenient, and perfectly suited to the new suburban lifestyle that was often centered around a new piece of technology, the television set. The name TV dinner brilliantly linked the meal to this new form of family entertainment. The aluminum tray could be eaten from directly, saving on washing up. It was the ultimate expression of the post-war desire for ease and efficiency. The legacy of these military-inspired meals is immense. They paved the way for the entire frozen food aisle in the modern supermarket. The TV dinner introduced the idea of the portion-controlled heat-and-eat meal that is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. It changed not just what people ate, but how they ate, moving away from the communal family meal prepared from scratch toward a more individualized, convenience-oriented approach to food. The humble frozen dinner on its aluminum tray has its origins in the cold, high-altitude cabins of wartime bombers. How did the idea of convenience become one of the most powerful forces in our food culture? What nutritional and social trade-offs did we make when we moved from home-cooked meals to processed, prepackaged ones? How much has the design of our kitchens and homes been influenced by the rise of convenience foods? And can we ever go back to a time when cooking was seen less as a chore to be avoided and more as a central part of family life? Number 9, can you use food to win a war without firing a shot? When we think of war, we think of weapons and armies. But the Second World War solidified the idea of food as a powerful tool of statecraft, a way to project power, win allies, and shape the post-war world. The concept began with programs designed to support allies during the conflict. The most famous of these was the Lend-Lease Act, signed into law in the United States in March 1941, before the U.S. even entered the war. Under this program, the U.S. shipped enormous quantities of material, including vast amounts of food, to allied nations like the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. This was a strategic decision. Leaders like President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that a hungry Britain or a starving Soviet army could not effectively fight the Axis powers. And food was as vital as bullets and tanks. The U.S. became the arsenal of democracy and also its larder. American farms ramped up production to feed not only their own country and military, but those of their allies as well. This established a direct link between American agricultural abundance and global political strategy. The ability to produce a food surplus became a recognized source of national power. This idea became even more important as the war ended and the challenge of rebuilding a devastated Europe began. The continent was on the brink of mass starvation. Infrastructure was destroyed, farms were in ruins, and populations were displaced. U.S. leaders recognized that this chaos and desperation created a fertile ground for political instability. A humanitarian crisis could quickly become a political one. The solution was to use America's food surplus as a tool for stabilization and reconstruction. This was the logic behind the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, which began in 1948. While it is often remembered for providing funds to rebuild industries and infrastructure, a huge component of the plan was food aid. In the first years of the plan, a significant portion of the aid was in the form of food, fertilizer, and agricultural machinery shipped from the United States. This aid was crucial in preventing widespread famine and social unrest in countries like France, Italy, and West Germany. This use of food aid had a dual purpose. It was a genuine humanitarian effort to prevent suffering, but it was also a powerful political tool in the emerging Cold War. By providing food and aid, the United States helped to stabilize Western European economies and governments, making them less susceptible to the influence of the Soviet Union. And American food became a symbol of prosperity and a key weapon in an ideological struggle. This policy was formalized in 1954 with Public Law 480, also known as the Food for Peace program, which made food aid a permanent part of U.S. foreign policy. The war and its aftermath had demonstrated that a shipload of wheat could be as strategically important as an aircraft carrier. Has the use of food as a political tool sometimes done more harm than good by creating dependency or disrupting local agricultural economies? How does a nation's ability to feed itself relate to its political independence? When food aid is used to achieve political goals, can it truly be considered a humanitarian act? And in a world of complex global supply chains, who really holds the power when it comes to food? Number 8. Why was there an international meeting about fish in 1945? It seems strange. In May of 1945, as the war in Europe was just ending and the conflict in the Pacific was still raging, representatives from around the world gathered in Hot Springs, Virginia. Their topic was not peace treaties or war reparations. It was food and agriculture. This meeting, the United Nations Conference on Food and Agriculture, was a direct result of the lessons learned during the war. The conflict had shown in the most brutal way possible that hunger and political instability were deeply intertwined. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a key proponent of the conference, believed that a lasting peace could not be built on a foundation of hunger and poverty. The war had demonstrated that food was a global issue. A crop failure in one part of the world could affect the stability of another. Supply chains were international. The war had forced nations to think about food not just within their own borders, but as a complex, interconnected global system. The pre-war world of isolated national agricultural policies seemed dangerously inadequate. The Hot Springs Conference was the first time that nations came together to formally recognize that freedom from want was a shared international responsibility. The delegates agreed that science and cooperation could be used to improve agricultural productivity and nutrition for everyone. The most concrete outcome of this meeting was the creation of a new international organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO. The FAO was officially established in Quebec City, Canada, in October 1945. Its mission, laid out in its constitution, was to raise levels of nutrition and standards of living, to improve agricultural productivity, and to better the condition of rural populations. The creation of the FAO was a radical idea. It institutionalized the wartime understanding that food security was a prerequisite for global security. The organization was tasked with collecting and analyzing data on global agriculture, providing technical assistance to developing countries, and acting as a neutral forum where nations could discuss food and farming policy. Its early work focused on post-war reconstruction, providing expert advice on everything from fisheries management, the subject of many early technical meetings, to controlling locust plagues. The FAO and other similar international bodies that emerged in the post-war era, like the World Food Program, fundamentally changed how we approach global hunger. They are the institutional legacy of the wartime realization that food problems do not respect national borders. The work of these organizations in promoting the Green Revolution, fighting animal diseases, and providing emergency food aid is a direct continuation of the global mindset forged during the war. The conflict forced humanity to think about its food supply as a single, shared system for the first time. Have these large international organizations become too bureaucratic and disconnected from the needs of small farmers? Can a centralized, top-down approach truly solve the diverse and localized problems of hunger and malnutrition? By focusing on industrial-scale productivity, did these organizations inadvertently contribute to the loss of biodiversity and traditional farming practices? And is it possible to achieve global food security without first addressing the political and economic inequalities that create hunger in the first place? Number 7, how did a technology for spotting enemy planes change your kitchen? The connection is not obvious. One is a critical piece of military hardware. The other is a common household appliance. The link between them is a device called the magnetron, and its story shows how wartime innovation can have completely unexpected peacetime consequences. The magnetron is a high-powered vacuum tube that generates microwaves. During the Second World War, British scientists developed a practical cavity magnetron that could produce short wavelength microwaves at a high power level. This was a massive technological breakthrough. It allowed for the development of small, powerful radar systems that could be installed on airplanes and ships. This compact radar gave Allied forces a significant advantage. It allowed them to detect enemy submarines and aircraft at night and in bad weather, playing a crucial role in battles like the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Atlantic. The technology was so important that it was shared with the United States in 1940 as part of a technology sharing mission. American companies like Raytheon were given contracts to mass produce magnetrons for the war effort. By the end of the war, Raytheon was a major manufacturer of this key radar component. The discovery of its cooking potential was a complete accident. In 1945, a self-taught American engineer at Raytheon named Percy Spencer was working on an active radar set. He had a chocolate bar in his pocket. He noticed that it had melted. Intrigued, he experimented with other foods. He tried popcorn kernels, which started popping all over his lab. The next day, he tried an egg, which exploded. Spencer realized that the low-density microwave energy from the magnetron was heating the food. He had discovered microwave cooking. Raytheon's leadership, looking for new products to pivot to after the war, saw the potential. The company filed a patent for a microwave cooking process in 1945. The first commercial microwave oven was produced in 1947. It was called the Rataranj. These early models were nothing like the compact ovens we know today. They were enormous, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 750 pounds. They also cost several $1,000s, the equivalent of over $50,000 today. Their first customers were not households, but institutions like restaurants, hospitals, and military canteens. It took another 2 decades for the technology to be miniaturized and for the price to come down enough for it to become a consumer product. The development of a smaller, less expensive magnetron in the 1960s, along with a growing public appetite for speed and convenience, finally brought the microwave oven into the home. By the 1980s, it was a standard kitchen appliance. The microwave revolutionized home cooking, or rather, home reheating. It was perfectly suited for the pre-packaged frozen meals that were also a legacy of the war. A technology designed for detecting distant enemies had found its ultimate home heating up leftovers and popping popcorn. What other transformative technologies might be hidden inside military hardware today? How did the post-war consumers' desire for speed and efficiency shape which wartime innovations were commercialized? By making it so easy to reheat food, did the microwave contribute to the decline of traditional cooking skills? And what are the unseen health or social consequences of fundamentally changing the way we apply heat to our food? Number 6, could rationing have been good for us? Rationing is a word we associate with deprivation, long lines, and bland food. During the Second World War, it was a system of controlled distribution of scarce goods implemented by governments to ensure that everyone, from the wealthiest to the poorest, got a fair share of essential items like sugar, meat, butter, and gasoline. While it was born of necessity and often resented, some evidence suggests that for many people, the wartime diet imposed by rationing was actually healthier than the diet they had before or after the war. In both the United Kingdom and the United States, rationing was designed by nutrition experts. The goal was not just to distribute calories, but to ensure a nutritionally adequate diet for the entire population. In Britain, the Ministry of Food carefully calculated the rations to provide enough protein, vitamins, and minerals for health and hard work. The national diet became much less reliant on meat, sugar, and fat, which were heavily rationed, and much more reliant on vegetables, potatoes, and whole grain bread. The government actively encouraged people to eat these unrationed foods through campaigns like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete. The results were surprising. A number of studies, both at the time and retrospectively, have shown that this forced dietary shift led to significant public health improvements. A 1946 study published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, noted a decrease in heart disease and diabetes during the war years. In his 2011 book, The Taste of War, historian Sir John Boyd Orr pointed out that infant mortality in Britain declined steadily throughout the war, and the growth rates of children actually improved. The poor, who previously could not afford a varied and nutritious diet, were now guaranteed access to one. The wealthy were forced to eat less fat and sugar. The nation as a whole was eating a simpler, more balanced diet. A similar, though less stringent, system was in place in the United States. Rationing of items like sugar and red meat encouraged people to explore other foods. The focus on Victory Gardens meant a huge increase in fresh vegetable consumption. The government's U.S. Needs U.S. Strong campaign promoted nutritious, simple meals. While it's harder to isolate the health effects in the U.S., the period saw a national focus on nutrition and home cooking that was unprecedented. The experience of rationing also had a profound impact on attitudes toward food waste. When food was scarce and precious, every scrap was used. The government ran campaigns with slogans like, "Food is a weapon, don't waste it." This fostered a culture of frugality and resourcefulness that stands in stark contrast to the modern problem of food waste, where it's estimated that up to a third of all food produced is thrown away. The war forced a generation to learn the true value of food. After the war, with the return of abundance and the rise of consumer culture, these lessons were quickly forgotten. The blandness and lack of choice associated with rationing made people eager to embrace the variety and richness of the post-war supermarket. If a restricted diet was demonstrably healthier, why did we so enthusiastically abandon it? What does it say about our food choices that a period of forced scarcity led to better health outcomes than a period of unlimited abundance? Could a modern version of rationing focused on sustainability and health rather than scarcity ever be politically possible? And how did we go from a culture that valued every last crumb to one that wastes food on an industrial scale? Number 5, did a fear of hunger give birth to the Green Revolution? The term Green Revolution usually refers to the period in the 1960s and 1970s when new agricultural technologies dramatically increased crop yields in developing countries. But the mindset and the scientific foundation for this revolution were forged in the crucible of the Second World War. The war created a global obsession with food security. Leaders who had seen nations brought to their knees by hunger became convinced that agricultural self-sufficiency and surplus were matters of national survival and global stability. This conviction drove a massive post-war investment in agricultural research. The goal was to apply the same kind of focused, science-driven, industrial approach that had won the war to the problem of feeding the world. The effort was led by scientists who had often been involved in the war effort and was funded by governments and foundations that saw agricultural development as a key strategy in the Cold War. They believed that preventing hunger in developing nations was a way to prevent them from turning to communism. A key figure in this movement was the American agronomist Norman Borlaug. During the war, Borlaug worked as a microbiologist at a chemical company, conducting research on fungicides and bactericides for the military. After the war, in 1944, he was recruited by a new program sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Mexican government to improve wheat production in Mexico. The country was importing much of its grain and was facing a food crisis. Borlaug and his team applied a systematic, intensive approach. They used new synthetic fertilizers and pesticides products of the wartime chemical industry. They developed new irrigation techniques. And most importantly, they used intensive plant breeding to develop new high-yield varieties of wheat. These new strains were short, which prevented them from falling over when heavily fertilized, and they were resistant to diseases like rust. The results were astonishing. By the late 1950s, Mexico was self-sufficient in wheat production. The success in Mexico became the model for the rest of the world. Borlaug's high-yield wheat varieties were introduced to India and Pakistan in the mid-1960s, a time when those countries were facing imminent famine. The new seeds, combined with fertilizer and irrigation, led to a spectacular increase in production, turning the region from a food importer to a food exporter in a matter of years. This was the Green Revolution. Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work, which is credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation. This revolution was a direct application of the wartime model. Identify a single critical problem crop yield, apply massive resources and the latest technology, chemicals, genetics, irrigation, and achieve a dramatic result. It was a technological triumph. However, it also brought the American model of high-input industrial monoculture farming to the entire world. Our critics point out that this has led to a loss of crop biodiversity, increased dependence on chemical inputs, and social disruption, as small farmers were often unable to afford the new seeds and chemicals. The war created the fear of hunger, and that fear gave birth to a powerful but controversial solution. Did the single-minded focus on yield cause us to ignore other important qualities in our food, like nutrition and taste? How did the Green Revolution change the power dynamics in global agriculture, shifting control from farmers to large multinational seed and chemical companies? By solving the problem of calories, did we create a new set of problems related to environmental degradation and public health? And can the lessons of the Green Revolution be adapted to create a more sustainable second Green Revolution for the 21st century? Number 4, how did a can of processed meat become a global icon? Before the war, it was just another canned meat product. But the Second World War took a humble lunch meat made by the Hormel Foods Corporation and turned it into one of the most recognized food brands on the planet. The product was Spam. Introduced in 1937, its name is a portmanteau of spiced ham. Its key advantages were that it was inexpensive, made from a less desirable cut of meat pork shoulder, and most importantly, it was shelf-stable. It could sit in a can for years without refrigeration. When the war began, these qualities made it the perfect military food. The U.S. military bought it in enormous quantities. Over 150 million pounds of Spam were shipped abroad to feed Allied troops and civilians. It became a staple in the diet of American GIs, who gave it nicknames like "ham that didn't pass its physical." They ate it fried for breakfast, in sandwiches for lunch, and mixed with whatever else was available for dinner. Their feelings about it were often mixed, a combination of gratitude for a hot meal and monotony from eating it day after day. But the story of Spam goes far beyond the American military. Through the Lend-Lease program, it was shipped to allies around the world. In the United Kingdom, where fresh meat was severely rationed, Spam became a welcome, if sometimes mocked, source of protein. In the war-torn Soviet Union, where people were facing starvation, cans of Spam were a literal lifesaver. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs that without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army. After the war, Spam's global journey continued. It had been introduced to cultures all over the world, and in many places it stuck. In places that had been heavily occupied by the U.S. military, like Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, Spam became deeply integrated into the local cuisine. It was seen not as a cheap substitute, but as a desirable, modern American food. In Hawaii, Spam musubi, a slice of fried Spam on a block of rice wrapped in seaweed, is a beloved local snack. In South Korea, a country ravaged by the Korean War, Spam was introduced through U.S. Army bases and became a luxury item. Today, it is a key ingredient in dishes like budai jjigae, Army stew, and is often given as a high-end gift set for the holidays. The war took a simple American product and gave it a complex international history. It became a symbol of American industrial might, a tool of survival, an object of ridicule, and a cherished part of local cultures. Its journey tells the story of the war's global reach and its long, often surprising, cultural aftermath. The global distribution network created by the war to move military supplies became a channel for cultural exchange, where the canned meat product is one of its most enduring ambassadors. What does it mean when a food born of scarcity becomes a symbol of cultural identity? How do the logistics of war create new, lasting culinary traditions? What other lowbrow foods have a surprisingly complex and important history? And how does the story of Spam challenge our ideas about what constitutes authentic cuisine? Number 3, did we try to save our seeds because we were afraid of bombs? The idea of a seed bank, a secure facility where the genetic material of crops is preserved for the future seed, seems like a very modern concern, born of fears about climate change and biodiversity loss. But some of the earliest motivations for systematic long-term seed preservation came from the anxieties of the Second World War. The war demonstrated the fragility of agricultural systems. It showed how quickly crop production could be disrupted and how valuable genetic resources could be lost forever. One of the most powerful stories from this period is that of the Pavlov's experimental station near Leningrad, now St. Petersburg in the Soviet Union. The station housed an immense collection of seeds and tubers gathered from around the world by the pioneering Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov. It was one of the world's first and most important seed banks. When the German army laid siege to the city in 1941, the scientists at the station faced a terrible choice. The siege lasted for nearly 900 days, and the city was racked by a famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The scientists, starving along with their fellow citizens, chose to protect the seed collection. They barricaded themselves in the station, guarding the vast collection of rice, wheat, corn, and most famously, a huge collection of potatoes. They knew that this genetic library was irreplaceable and would be vital for rebuilding Soviet agriculture after the war. According to the station's records, at least 9 of the scientists starved to death, surrounded by tons of edible food, because they saw the future of their country's food supply as more important than their own lives. This incredible story and the general wartime threat to agricultural resources highlighted a new kind of vulnerability. It wasn't just armies and cities that could be destroyed, a nation's agricultural heritage could be wiped out as well. This realization planted the seed for the modern global seed banking movement. After the war, as the Cold War began, the fear of a nuclear conflict added a new urgency to these efforts. What would happen to the world's major crops if a nuclear winter destroyed a season's harvest? This led to the establishment of more secure, long-term seed storage facilities around the world. The U.S. government, for example, established the National Seed Storage Laboratory, now the National Laboratory for Genetic Resources Preservation, in Fort Collins, Colorado, in 1958. Its initial design incorporated features to protect it from a nuclear attack. These efforts culminated in the creation of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Doomsday Vault, on a remote Norwegian island, which opened in 2008. It is the ultimate backup for the world's crop diversity, a direct descendant of the fears and lessons of the 20th century's great conflicts. The war taught us that preserving the ability to grow food was as important as any military defense. How many other irreplaceable collections of scientific or cultural value were lost during the conflicts of the 20th century? If the scientists at Pavlovsk had chosen to eat the seeds, how would that have changed post-war agriculture? What are the modern threats to our genetic resources that we are currently ignoring? And is our global food supply dangerously dependent on too few crop varieties, making us vulnerable to a new kind of famine? Number 2, how did the way we raise animals become a factory? The drive for efficiency during the Second World War was not limited to crops and machines. It also transformed how we raise animals for meat. The need to produce massive quantities of protein quickly and cheaply to feed soldiers and civilians pushed animal agriculture toward a more industrial model. This was the beginning of the shift away from the traditional farm, where animals often roamed freely, to the more confined, systematic methods that would evolve into modern factory farming. One of the key developments was in the poultry industry. Before the war, chicken was a relatively expensive meat, often reserved for special occasions. Most chickens were raised in small backyard flocks. The war's demand for meat, combined with the rationing of red meat, created a huge opportunity for the poultry industry. The government actively encouraged chicken production. To meet this demand, farmers and scientists began to experiment with new methods to raise chickens faster and in larger numbers. This led to the development of broiler houses, large enclosed buildings where thousands of birds could be raised at once. This system of indoor confinement allowed for greater control over the animal's environment, food, and growth rate. Scientists focused on breeding chickens that would grow faster on less feed. They developed specialized high-protein feeds, often using the surplus of soy and corn that was being produced by the newly mechanized and fertilized farms. The discovery of antibiotics in this period also played a crucial role. Adding low doses of antibiotics to animal feed was found to promote growth and prevent the spread of disease in the crowded conditions of these new facilities. This practice, first documented in a 1946 study by A.C. Groschke and H.R. Bird, became standard in the post-war era. A similar shift was happening in the pork and beef industries, though it happened more slowly. The idea of concentrating animals in feedlots where they could be fattened up quickly on a grain-based diet gained traction. While this was far more efficient than letting them graze on pasture, the entire system was being re-engineered for maximum output at minimum cost, applying the logic of a factory assembly line to living creatures. This industrial model was championed as a modern scientific triumph. It made meat, particularly chicken, much more affordable and widely available to the average consumer after the war. The chicken in every pot that had once been a political slogan became a reality for many, but this efficiency came at a cost. The system raised profound ethical questions about animal welfare. It created new environmental problems, such as the disposal of massive amounts of concentrated animal waste. And the routine use of antibiotics in animal feed is now recognized as a major contributor to the growing problem of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, a major threat to human health. The factory-like system designed to meet a wartime emergency became the permanent and controversial foundation of our modern meat supply. What is the true cost of cheap meat when we factor in animal welfare and environmental impact? How did the drive for efficiency change our relationship with the animals we eat? By removing animals from the land and into confinement, what essential ecological cycles did we break? And can we design a system that provides affordable protein without relying on industrial-scale confinement and routine antibiotic use? Number one, what if the war never really ended on the farm? The Second World War was a period of intense existential crisis. To survive, nations adopted a new way of thinking about food and farming. It was a wartime mentality. The goal was singular maximized production. The enemy was anything that stood in the way of that goal, whether it was pests, weeds, labor shortages, or the limits of the soil itself. The tools were industrial and chemical. The battlefield was the farm field. And when the treaties were signed and the soldiers came home, this wartime mentality never left the farm. It became the new normal. Think about the legacy. We fight weeds with chemical herbicides derived from biological warfare research. We fight pests with insecticides developed to protect soldiers from tropical diseases. We feed our crops with nitrogen synthesized in repurposed munitions plants. We have consolidated our farms into massive, hyper-specialized monocultures, a system designed for the efficient production of commodities, not for ecological resilience. Our entire global food system is built on a logistical framework designed to supply armies across oceans. This approach achieved its primary objective. It produced an incredible abundance of cheap calories, allowing the global population to triple since 1945. It staved off the famines that many feared would define the post-war world. In the language of war, it was a victory. But it was a victory with immense collateral damage. The sustained chemical assault on our farmland has degraded our soil, polluted our water, and decimated populations of pollinators and other beneficial insects. The industrial model of animal agriculture has created serious ethical and environmental problems. The reliance on a few high-yield crops has created a dangerously fragile food system vulnerable to disease and climate change. The language we still use in agriculture often betrays this wartime legacy. Farmers talk about the war on weeds. While companies market products that combat pests, we see nature not as a system to work with, but as an adversary to be conquered and controlled through technology. This mindset, born of a desperate global conflict, is now a primary driver of our modern ecological crises, from climate change to biodiversity loss. The war provided a set of powerful tools and a powerful ideology for how to use them, and we have been using them ever since. Perhaps the most profound change of all was this shift in mindset. The war replaced a diverse, biologically based agriculture with a simplified, chemically based one. It replaced a system that valued resilience with one that valued only efficiency. We are now living in the long aftermath of that victory, grappling with the consequences of a war that was won on the battlefield, but continues to be fought every day in the soil of our farms. Have we become so successful at winning the war for production that we are losing the war for sustainability? What would it take to declare a peace treaty with nature on our farms? Can we disentangle the genuinely useful technologies developed during the war from the destructive adversarial mindset that came with them? And is it possible to build a food system that can feed the world without treating the world as an enemy?